Today, Nechama Goldman Barash teaching. Nechama is a graduate of Nishmat's Karen Ariel Yoetzet Halacha program and of Halacha, which is Matan's Advanced Halachic Institute. She also completed an MA in Talmud from Bar-Ilan and graduated before that from Matan's Advanced Talmud Institute. Nechama also trained as a sex educator through Yahel and the Yoetzet Center. She teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan, Pardes, and Midrashat Torah Avodah. Nechama is an active member of Beit Hillel, which I'll tell you about if you're interested, and participates in interfaith dialogue through Roots based in Gush Etzion. She's currently working on a book about gender and halacha. And today, Nechama will be teaching about the complicated and very relevant question of civil marriage in Israel. Thank you.
I think some people still don't have the handouts.
Okay, so there's one more here, and I'll go downstairs and bring up a few more. This is without questions. I'll go down and bring up one more.
Okay, good morning everyone. Nice that the sun came out. So it's actually quite lovely to be standing here and looking at the view. What I'm going to talk about really, well, let me start off by asking, how many of you live in a democracy? Okay. How many of you live in, what believe that Israel should be a Jewish state? Okay, so it's a complicated question. I didn't say a religious state, if you noticed. I said a Jewish state. Okay, the question of whether Israel is a democracy, in the sense of America, England, France, and so on and so forth, is a complicated question. Because Israel is a democracy. Of course, we have a government that we vote for democratically, and people, in theory, can live the lives that they choose to live without persecution. They are protected under the law to live a life based on choices that they make, and so on. But their, marriage is probably the area in which the conflict between the Jewish state and a democratic state really come to the fore. And what I mean by that is, those of you who live in America or in Europe can choose to marry whom you want with whatever ceremony you want. It is considered one of the basic rights under, I'm just going to quote for you, the universal, it is a universal right, hold on 1 second. One of the definitions of democracy is being able to marry who you want, when you want. Oh, here it is. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948, says as follows. Men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the full right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. The family is the natural and fundamental unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. So that is something that was set out by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, since 1948, there have been a lot of questions of what defines the unit of family in the wake, especially in the last 20 years, of single-sex families, single women having children, and so on and so forth. We'll touch on that a little bit. I will already say, does anyone disagree with marriage and the family being protected by the state being a fundamental right of citizens of the state? I disagree with that. So I'd say Judaism, of course, values the family, right? Marriage, having children, that's considered one of the core values or mitzvot that people are raised to aspire to. So where's the conflict? Well, the conflict starts in 1951 when a law is, 1953, I'm sorry, when the rabbinical court's law was passed. This law declares that all marriage ceremonies, without exception, must be authorized by a religious court. So it affects Jews, Christians, and Muslims equally. In other words, there is no such thing as civil marriage in this country. It's only religious marriage. If you're Christian, you go to the church. If you're Muslim, you go to the mosque. If you're Jewish, you go to the rabbinic court. There is no intermarriage between faiths. And when it comes to Jews, obviously, the rabbinical courts decide who is Jewish. You can't self-define. We know that halachically you are defined as Jewish if you have a mother on the maternal side, a mother or grandmother who is halachically Jewish. But if you have a father or a grandparent, not from the mother's side, you are not halachically Jewish. The rabbinical courts also determine what conversions are valid. So for instance, if you're a mother or grandmother, and I'm dealing with a case, I deal with these cases all the time, a student whose grandmother converted through the conservative movement back in the 1950s, when the conservative movement largely only had rabbis who were Shomer Shabbos, and there's already the second case I've had, and his mother was not religious, right? But he became a Baal Tshuva, and there's now a question whether we consider his status to be a Jew, because if we go back to the grandmother, her conversion was through a conservative Beit Din, only of men were Shomer Shabbos with the conservative movement, and now there's a question whether he's Jewish. So the rabbinical courts also have absolute control over who is defined as Jewish. Okay, so that's some of the issues that begin coming up in 2019, but really have been there since the state was founded. On paper, it sounds like it makes sense. What could be wrong with requiring religious marriage, right? It's a Jewish state that has within it value of religion, particularly within family units. And so Christianity would agree and Islam would agree. But the question of whether the rights of citizens are best met by a law of this nature becomes paramount from the 1990s on, when 1 million Russians make Aliyah, many of whom are not halachically Jewish. And now you have something in the neighborhood of 400,000 citizens, depending on who you ask, right? Depending on the numbers you want to quote, but an enormous number of citizens who cannot get married in the state in which they reside. That's complicated. That means there are citizens whose basic rights to create family cannot be met in this country. Okay, so those are one population. The Ethiopians, of course, were not considered halakhically Jewish and were mass converted, which caused its own set of complication. And then there are the smaller numbers of Kohanim, for instance, who want to marry divorcees or converts and cannot do so. So again, if we talk about a democracy, you're bringing in essentially halachic Judaism to decide who is allowed to get married in this country and who is not. Conservative rabbis cannot perform weddings, Reform rabbis cannot perform weddings, and not all Orthodox rabbis can perform weddings. So there's a very select number or list of people who are allowed to perform. Women, of course, cannot perform weddings, right? And you are breaking the law if you do not use only the lists of rabbis who are authorized by the Rabbanut. Okay? So that led to a ridiculous situation a year and a half ago, where a conservative rabbi who had been performing weddings for decades, already an older man in his 60s, was awoken at 5 in the morning. What?
I said,
Ancient.
well beyond my
I'm already getting close to that age, so I allow myself to be included in that. But someone already who had been doing this for decades was woken at 5 in the morning by the police and arrested because the Haifa Rabbinical Court decided it was time to flex its muscle and crack down on these illegal marriages. So in the last, not that this hasn't been an issue since 1953, but in the last 25 years, there have been increasingly vehement cries to reassess this rabbinical court's law and to open up civil marriage in one way or another. I will also say this obviously, and again, we are a Western democracy in many ways, affects gay couples who are trying to get married, and couples, the tens of thousands of couples who go to Cyprus every year, either because they refuse to get married through the rabbinical court or they are unable to get married through the rabbinical court. So we have a very complicated situation. And the reason, and so what I want to do now, any questions? Yes?
It's relevant, isn't it, what the history of this was?
Well,
Why?
The history, I'm about to say that. I'm about to explain why they, yes.
One more question.
Yeah.
Are the Cyprus marriages recognized?
Okay, so thank you. That's a very important piece. All marriages that take place outside of Israel, in countries in which Israel has agreements, are recognized by the Interior Ministry. So you have a very, including gay marriages, including intermarriages, all of those are recognized by the Interior Ministry if they take place in a country with which Israel has international relations. That includes Cyprus. Certainly includes Canada and America and all the European countries. So you end up with a ludicrous scenario. The Interior Ministry has to recognize all of these as married. The rabbinical court, of course, doesn't recognize any of these as marriages. And then two problems. First of all, what are the rights? What are the rights of the partners in these relationships legally under the law? Because the Interior Ministry recognizes them. But the rabbinical courts, which have full jurisdiction over what is defined as marriage, does not. So really complicated. In addition, when these partnerships dissolve, when these marriages dissolve, as a certain percentage of them obviously do, you end up with a really problematic scenario unless they signed prenup agreements that essentially talked already about what would happen in the case of divorce, right? Very similar to what happened in the States, with gay marriage. Meaning that in Vermont you could get married, but if you lived in Texas and you wanted to get divorced, divorce can only take place in the state in which you reside. Marriage can take place in any of the 50 states. So you could go to Reno, right? You go to Las Vegas and you get married. You could only get a quickie divorce if you had no property that you wanted to contest or child rights that you wanted to work out. So even in the states, the fact that you could get married in all 50 states, but you can only get divorced, again, if you have property and assets you want to split, can only be done in the state in which you reside, created a lot of problems in general also for couples that got married in one state but couldn't get divorced in that state, how to come back. So Israel has a similar problem. Yes, I will say there are ways of handling that, especially if a couple has foresight and already signed some sort of contract in which they set out what it would look like if they get divorced. But that's even harder to do than a prenup, than a halachic prenup, right? A prenup already says what assets you're not going to get in the case of divorce. But here you really have to set out something that is basically a divorce document before you get married. You can do it after you're married, but it's complicated. So these are the pieces that are creating the noise from the bottom up. Like, why don't we have civil marriage? Why is there no civil divorce? How are we going to handle situations like no-fault divorce, which Halacha does not have in any way, or alimony, which Halacha does not have? Like, why don't we have any sort of structures to deal with some of the situations that in modernity Western democracies have? The question of the background, okay, the justification for this was as follows. The justification for the law, and again, Israel was a much smaller country. The idea was the ability to marry, the idea was the Rabbanut be given full jurisdiction over marriage and divorce in order to keep straight, right, who's married, in the case of divorce, mamzerut. In other words, this idea of making sure married women are fully divorced for the next generation, for the next marriage, for the remarriage. I will say that's a lovely justification. In America and England and France, you don't get to use that justification. You have to follow the law of the land, and all courts have a way of keeping track of this kind of thing. In other words, Israel was basically making a statement that since the Rabbanut decides who is Jewish, and since it's important to prevent this spread of mamzerim, and now I'm going to define what a mamzer is. A mamzer, very specifically, is not an illegitimate child, right? It's not the bastard of English literature that is like, you know, in the wealthy circles is expected. I mean, obviously a certain number of illegitimate children are born from whatever happens there, especially in the monarchy. And it's not, you know, it's not outside of wedlock. What it is either from incest, children born out of incestuous relationships, parent, child, or sibling, or children born, pay attention, to a married Jewish woman who has a relationship with a Jewish man who is not her husband. Everyone following that? In other words, if it's a non-Jewish man, the child is not a mamzer. It is only if it is a woman who is considered married by Jewish law, who has an affair with a man who is not her husband, who is Jewish. A Jewish man who has an affair with a non-married woman, even if he's no problem. Okay, no mamzer. I shouldn't say no problem. That's a little too simplistic. But that is not halachic adultery. Halachic adultery is specifically a Jewish married woman with a man who is Jewish and not her husband. But of course, in this country, women who cannot get divorces, who remain agunot, do not have the luxury of finding non-Jewish partners. It's not an option, right? And so they are stuck. They often spend years in limbo wanting to have children and being stuck, not wanting to have mamzerim, even if they're not religious, even if they already have a partner. They often will take great preventative measures to not have a child because of the fear of mamzerim. So you are right that the mamzer question was the main reason that the rabbinate went to the courts and said, you need to let us have control over marriage and divorce so that we can prevent the spread of mamzer. That was what was, is there something else you think was
There were a lot more things in the past before that led to, the many countries that absolutely required civil marriage. If you sort of then under the wire wanted to have a religious marriage, some places you could get away with it, and some places you couldn't, but you could not substitute that.
Right. So in France, for instance, I believe today you can only have a civil marriage. You must have a civil marriage
In Russia.
Yeah, in Russia. That's very modern. Civil marriage in general was only from the late 1700s. Civil marriage in countries across Europe. It began in Germany and France and then England. You could not actually have a civil marriage, which is why intermarriage was so low. Or people converted. You couldn't have intermarriage. Someone had to convert, like in Israel. So we're going back to an 18th century model, basically pre-18th century. Okay, but the main reason for the rabbinic court. So what I want to look at today, the question is, what can we do? What can we do? And I will say what's fascinating is a lot of the push is coming from religious, men, particularly men, but it doesn't have to be men, but religious men who are professors of law, who are pushing for civil marriage, who are saying enough. We cannot, we cannot justify this kind of gross violation of human rights with this law anymore. We have to figure out an option. Now, at the end, I will give you the options that are on the table. Okay, it's very interesting what's happening today. I think probably in the next, I would say 5 years, we're already going to move to that. There already have been certain laws passed that are moving towards that. But it's obviously a big deal, and it's an interesting question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is it just the consequence of becoming a Jewish state that has opened up a law of return that recognizes non-halachic Jews as citizens, right? You could go back to the law of return, right? The law of return allows for, a grandparent who is Jewish. That's what led to the Russian Aliyah. Right? So you have all of these people living here who define as Jewish who are not halachically Jewish. So that's, again, where some of the interior ministry versus the rabbinate. That's largely where the complexity arises. So what I want to look at today is what happens if someone gets married non-halachically? Do they need a Jewish divorce? And for that, in your chavruta, what I want you to think about is, what makes someone married? What is marriage? Is it a protocol? Is it a ceremony, a very specific, very scripted ceremony? Or is it a state of being? Is it a status? Is it a way we live? And what is a marriage? And once we answer that question, we'll be able to then say, so who needs to get divorced? Is it people who only went through certain channels to get married? Or is it people who live as if they're married? Live as married. Right? Those are going to be the question that the halachic sources, the rabbinic authorities, basically from the time of the Talmud, or really post-Talmud and post-1200s, really, are going to be asking. Because only with the son of Maimonides do we begin having scenarios where Jews are getting married outside of their communities. Right? Well, at least we have tshuvas, we have shutim, we have responsa. It could be it was happening before, but we begin having real questions. If a couple gets married here and then break up, and there's no divorce, can the woman remarry? Those questions begin to come up from 1200 on. They really begin to, hit the scene in the 20th century. 20th century, where civil marriage is very available, reform marriage, conservative marriage. What do we do with all those couples who are not coming back to the Beit Din to get divorced? What's the status of the woman? What's the status of her children? Those answers, the way we're going to answer those questions is going to affect very much what do we do if we open up civil marriage in this country? If there's an option of civil marriage, do we need to police it in order to make sure all of those women have halachic divorces, have gets, or not? And I'll just say one more point. The question of aguna is very much in the background here. The question of women who can't get Jewish divorces, can't get gitin from their husbands. Is there a way to ameliorate or alleviate that in populations, such as secular populations, where there's no real fidelity to Jewish law, but the get becomes an absolute, it's bad enough in the religious populations, but do we want to increase the amount of agunot by having everyone get married through kiddushin? Or is it possible that if not everyone gets married through kiddushin, we immediately alleviate the potential of agunot from a certain percentage of the population who are not going to get married through kiddushin? Okay, that's also in the background of this conversation.
And can I just clarify what you mean when you're talking about get, that's only for two people who are Jewish?
Yes.
So how does that become relevant for a mixed marriage?
It would become relevant for a mixed marriage.
Yeah.
That is correct. It would become relevant to two halachic Jews who got married outside of Orthodoxy.
Yes.
Yes, that's who would be relevant for. Of which,
So it wouldn't affect the 400,000 people
who are not halachic Jews, no, it would not affect them. It would not affect them.
So we
It
still
would open up the
so we
channel.
need a solution for
We need a
them
solution
too.
for them regardless.
Regardless
In
of
addition, right, and again, the consequence will be that those 400,000 will marry potentially halachic Jews, and then
Exactly.
you have,
Yeah.
yes, that's what the Rabbanut is fighting. And the question about agunot would be if again, the Chiloni population chooses, many of them choose to get married civilly, then would we have to run after them to make sure there's a get, or would we allow a civil divorce structure to replace gittin completely in the way that happens in, again, outside of Israel? So, so I will say that as much as, again, I'm very, very much a favor of democracy, but I also champion Jewish tradition and Jewish marriage, meaning it's that conflict. Do we want to open up a system here in the state of Israel in which we recognize that we're going to lose to some degree a certain percentage of the population? But the Democrat in me, democratic person in me, says I don't like coercion. And I don't like the fact that we coerce everyone to get married through a religious ceremony. We force every woman who's getting married to go to the mikvah. I don't think that's a productive way to encourage people to embrace religious practice and tradition. So, and I know it creates a lot of animosity. Again, many of the people who go to Cyprus are doing it to avoid kiddushin, even though they could get married through kiddushin, meaning it's an anti-Rabbanut protest. So, and it's happening as well among religious couples, small number, who get married privately and refuse to get married through the Rabbanut. Meaning there's definitely a pushback to this idea of religious coercion with marriage and with marriage. So that's part of what we're going to explore.
Very curious, how did South Africa, to such a great extent, manage to avoid this problem? It was socially accepted, I don't know about now, it was socially accepted for generations that regardless of whether you were religious or not, if you were Jewish, you gave a get.
Yeah, I think in England also. I would say the numbers are much smaller than either America or Israel. The communities are smaller. The numbers
It's
are
less
smaller.
politicized.
It's possible it's less politicized. It's true in those countries. Now, by the way, the reform movement is beginning to gain traction in South Africa and in England. But I think they were able to, again, it was a more conservative community. In general, the empire, the British Empire, countries under the empire are more conservative in general, nothing to do with religion. They are conservative. They are conservative countries. And so I think that the Jewish community reflected, I see it when I go to England even now, in terms of the way that the Batei Knesset live, in terms of even status of women, in terms of the learning opportunities for women. Meaning like, it's a more conservative country. I will say I spent time in South Africa and in England. In South Africa, one of the leading, she's a lawyer and she's working in one of the, I think it was in Cape Town. She said sexual harassment laws are so antiquated and so antedated, meaning in general, but it goes along with that idea that it's still more patriarchal than America is or Israel really is. And so it so that would explain it, meaning the religion is also very conservative. My guess is for all the religions. So that works as long as the community socially agrees to these situations. In a place like Sweden, of course, where intermarriage is like, I think it might be 80 or 90%, it's enormous, that's not gonna work. And so there the Jewish community embraces intermarriage, embraces intermarried couples into the Jewish community. So that's also social, right? Sweden, of course, is the exact opposite of the England, South Africa, Australia model. Nothing to do with, again, religion, but with a more liberal outlook. So I hear, yes, you're right. But Israel has become more complicated, and again, Russian Jewry kind of elevated this, this situation. But it is a situation that has been building for 70 years. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, so what I want to do is, and again, you can agree or not agree with my, the way I'm presenting it. This is a problem. Okay? This is a problem that is being addressed by rabbis and lawyers and judges alike. Various things have happened in the Knesset. You can go, I wrote 2 articles in the Times of Israel on this topic. You're welcome, especially after you see these sources. It'll be easy to follow the article. Different things have started to happen since 2006, 2010. The biggest move was the Knesset passed the civil union law for citizens with no religious affiliation. I know that's a mouthful. In other words, a couple can form a civil union if they agree to register in the Interior Ministry as having no religion. Now, I will say the Russian population, at least on the panels that I've sat in, define as Jewish, many of them, not all of them. They don't want to define as no religious affiliation because they'll say culturally we're Jewish. Like we're not, even if we're atheists, we're Jewish, meaning we define as Jewish. So it only affects a very small number of the population that are willing to define as not belonging to any religion. Again, secular Christians, secular Muslims, secular Jews, right? They don't want to define as nothing. But the civil union law was a big deal because it was an agreement between 2 partners who wished to establish a family union, legally protected by the state with legal rights, kind of like common law, which exists here as well. But common law, again, in all of your countries, is small. It's not meant to be a widespread, meaning large solution. It's meant to address a small percentage of the population. Civil union law also. The question is, should that become equal to marriage? Everyone can choose civil union or marriage, or should we bifurcate and have civil marriage and religious marriage? That's really what's on the table. Again, I'm giving you some of what we're going to get to at the end. So common law marriages are recognized ad hoc, meaning one by one, and civil union law is permitted to a very select group, self-selecting group of people who actively register as no religious affiliation. Both of those are protected by the state. I do want to say that. Both of those have protection. The question is, again, they can then go to courts and dissolve their relationship and so on and so forth. Okay, so what I want to look at now, because I do want to get to some learning and some sources, is what defines a halachic marriage, and those are the sources. You have questions that'll guide you through the learning. What you have initially is a Mishnah and a few pieces of Talmud, short pieces of Talmud, very important. Maimonides, which is very important. And then on page 6, you move to what I like the best, questions of real cases that come before rabbis that end up affecting or defining how we're going to define halachic marriage today, from the Middle Ages onward. I would ask that you not get, page 14 is where I have the end of the lecture, so there's no reason to get to that. Maybe we'll look at that when we come back. But I'd like to spend, I would say, an hour in Chavruta, hour and 5 minutes in Chavruta, where you begin to go through sources and understand where there might be halachic room to incorporate civil marriage or not. Again, you can decide. And at the end, again, how do we feel? It's not a simple. There's sometimes a kind of a gut reaction, yes or no. But I will say this is one of the hottest topics in kind of the democracy, religion, state. Should we separate religion and state, and so on? Marriage is really the epitome of the conflict between religion and state because it touches on divorce, it touches on conversion, and so on. Okay, questions? Great. Avrutas? Yes? Is there a way to... civic enterprise. How do we structure marriage? Because the Torah really does not have clear mandate not to marry and not how to get married. It does for divorce, but not for marriage. And yet it's clear, men take women, right? Isha Tisha. Avram takes Sarah, well, actually Yitzchak takes Rivka, Yaakov takes Rachel and Leah. And so we know men get married, they designate women and get married. Monogamy, of course, is only one-sided, right? A man can have multiple wives, concubines, and so on, but a woman becomes acquired by a man. Her sexual rights essentially belong to her husband. That's really what's being talked about in the Mishnah and Kiddushin. And so only really, I would say, already in the Mishnah and Talmud, you see a move towards monogamy in both directions, but it only really becomes codified in the 10th century, 11th century with Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, and only in Christendom, really. Meaning in many Islamic countries, polygamy is still very much permitted. It's permitted in Ethiopian communities, it's permitted in Yemen, it's permitted in some of the other Islamic countries until the 20th century. So when we think of a Jewish sexual ethic or Jewish marriage, we kind of intuitively go to one man, one woman. But it's important to recognize that was not really the case in many Jewish communities. It's just we often feel like the more advanced Jewish communities, right? That there's something intuitive Ashkenazi elite about thinking about how the Ashkenazim did it. Again, there were definitely Sephardi communities where polygamy was not allowed, but in quite a few it was. In Kurdistan it still was, and as I said, in Yemen. So that's just an aside, really, in terms of what marriage looks like. We're very used to a modern definition of marriage. We also feel marriage very much reflects love and shared interests. I'm kind of in arguments with various colleagues about whether that was always the case. It was not always the case. In other words, people got married for political reasons, for social reasons, for financial reasons, because women because their fathers said they had to. And that was very much the case into the 20th century. It's probably still the case in certain communities, meaning a little bit like what happens in the Indian communities and the Chinese communities where the parents of a young man choose his bride for him. I think ultimately he has veto power, but he doesn't know very much about his bride, and his parents check it out, like in the Hasidic community. Those models exist. It's just that all of us sitting here today don't really relate to those models because love and companionship and friendship have become part of that. So when we have Ha'isha Nikneit, this idea that a woman is acquired in three ways, it is deliberately a different language than the biblical lakach. So it's always an interesting question. Would it have been better Ha'isha Nilkechet b'shalosh shvachim? Would we have preferred that language? I would say to the modern reader, any language we use is going to be somewhat jarring because it reflects the imbalance in the marital structure. In other words, a man acquires a woman, Isha mitkadeshet. A woman is not the active partner in facilitating the marriage. It's true in today's modern Jewish halachic marriages, we try not to focus on that. We talk about kiddushin, and we talk about the husband and the wife, and the love, and we bring in shir hashirin. But legally, it is a very one-directional act in which the man says Hareat mikudeshet li, and she does not say Hareat mukudash li. So as much as we want to talk about kiddushin conceptually being this this wonderful space in which the couple commits, which they do, it really legally is an act where a man sets a woman apart for himself. She becomes committed, her sexuality again becomes, essentially belongs to him. Women today assume that men pledge fidelity as well. I do want to say that. Even though halachically there is a difference. Halachic adultery is only a married woman having an affair with a man other than her husband. Women today, and I wrote an article about this for Pardes a number of years ago, in the modern definition, adultery is both directional. Right? People assume fidelity. But the halachic language, nonetheless, continues what starts in the Torah and then continues in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Ha'isha nikneit b'shalosh shvachim. So that's really what am I talking too fast? You can slow me down. She's acquired in 3 ways, and konat atzma b'shtei drachim, and she acquires essentially the freedom of her sexual rights back in 2 ways: divorce or the death of her husband. And that's how she acquires her freedom back. This is not the time or the place. Come to Nishmat or come to whatever learning program to learn Kiddushin, fascinating tractate. The first chapter spends a lot of time explaining why a woman is not a slave or a field, even though the language of kinyan is the same root, same verb is used for acquisitions of property and of slaves. A woman is clearly not in that category, and Kiddushin explains very clearly and very quickly why a wife is different. She is not treated like a slave, she's not purchased like a slave or like a field, even though the language is similar. So there are 3 ways: kesef, shtar, or bia. Okay, kesef is the transfer of an object worth a minimal amount of money. Shtar is a document on which he writes for her something about his pledge to marry her, his acquiring her as wife. Bia, I think, needs no explanation: sexual relations for the purpose of the kinyan of marriage. Those are the 3 ways in which a woman can be taken as wife. What is missing?
Rabbi.
Well, there's no rabbi. Okay.
Ceremony or activity.
Some sort of ceremony, meaning do we need witnesses? Don't we need witnesses? Well, if it's a kinyan, then normally you do need witnesses, meaning if it's a legal transaction, normally you do. I mean, if I purchase a slave or I purchase a field, normally I would need to have some sort of something that essentially proves that I performed that action. So witnesses may be there. There's no language, right? Does he say anything? Is it just an action? Is she completely passive? Does she have to consent? Those are things that are missing from the Mishnah that will be fleshed out later in the Gemara, okay? But the bare skeleton of the ceremony where a man does an action expressing his desire to acquire a woman in marriage is presented here. Very quickly other pieces are filled in. There need to be witnesses, she needs to consent, and so on and so forth. That's what will eventually make its way into the ceremony. The ring is not in the Mishnah or in the Gemara. The ring seems to have evolved, and it makes sense why it appears as part of the ceremony, probably alongside other religions, Christianity for instance, this idea of giving a ring as the object of kesef, right? And then everyone does the same thing. So I want to point out in the Mishnah, you have your choice, 3 different models for acquiring a woman in marriage, and there's no uniformity. Meaning the object can also change. The Gemara actually talks about a date or a myrtle branch, something worth a pruta, meaning something very, very minimal. It could be this pen. No uniformity. Anyone can use whatever object they can pick up that's worth a pruta, right? And or it could be a document, or it could be sexual relations, and more or less that would facilitate the marriage. At a certain point, we move towards absolute uniformity. Yes, there are different customs, meaning Ashkenazi weddings and Sephardi weddings look slightly different, but at its heart, the halachic piece is all the same. The man gives the woman a ring. She knows it's worth more than a pruta. He says, Hareyat mikudeshet li b'tabad zo kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. There are 2 witnesses that are brought in to witness the Kiddushin, and then they're signed with the Ketubah and the Sheva Brachot and so on and so forth. We create an extremely uniform, very scripted ceremony. That will be relevant as we go through the sources, right? How important is it that it be that scripted, that the script be followed to a T? How important is that? If the couple exits stage right and begin to live together, isn't that enough? Haven't they shown their intent by what happens after? That's more or less, again, part of what I hope came up while you were learning. So those are the ways in which a woman is acquired. Let's take a look at Bia. The challenge, of course, is going to be, what about witnesses? I appreciate that Sfaria chooses to give us a slight, gauze, through which to see Bia. It seems to me, and there's no other way, in my opinion, I'm going to explain. What Sfaria did here, this is Sfaria, they talk about betrothing a woman through sexual intercourse as it is unsavory to invite witnesses to observe a man and woman enter a room to engage in intercourse. The problem, of course, is that's a bit of that's interpretation. A day biyah actually are meant to observe the act itself. In other words, I need witnesses for kesef, shtar, and biyah. Going into a room and shutting the door doesn't allow me to witness the act. I don't really know what happened, which is why in a different Gemara in Gittin, which I didn't bring you, they have an argument, are a day yichud the same as a day biyah? In other words, the witnesses to the seclusion, is that the same as the witnesses to actual biyah? The answer is no, of course not. Because we have no idea what goes on behind the door. Which is why as much as the Eidei Yichud in an Ashkenazi ceremony are considered to be reflective, Kesef, Shtar, Biyah, right? That we get all three. Kesef, he gives her the ring. Shtar, he gives her the ketubah, which is not the Shtar of the Mishnah. The Shtar of the Mishnah was a piece of paper or rock or leaf that he wrote Harayat Mekudeshet Li Bit Niyarzo, worth less than a pruta, meaning whatever object he writes on is understood to be worth less than the kesef, worth nothing, and then biyah is biyah, right? So we try to do all three in the Ashkenazi. We have the kesef, and then we do the ketubah, and then they go into a room and there are witnesses standing outside for yichud. But in Gittin, they make it clear that a day yichud and a day biyah are not the same thing. And if you got a little further along in your sources, you recognize that that's the exact point about which we're quibbling. The fact that a couple lives together, that a woman is pregnant, so clearly something's going on behind the closed doors, right? Does that prove that there's been biyah for kiddushin purposes? We're the Eidei Yichud. We all know when a couple begins to live together, presumably something's going on. But we're only Eidei Yichud, we're not Eidei biyah. So I appreciate what Sfaria is doing here, in that they want to everyone to, they don't really want to think about what Eidei biyah means. What would it mean for two witnesses to come in and witness the biyah? But the reality is, like with adultery, you can only convict a couple of capital punishment for adultery if you actually were close enough to see the act take place, right? That's what a dut is. Okay? Anyway. And that is why Rav does not like Kiddushay Biyah, for many reasons, right? It's not, he doesn't like Kiddushay Biyah because it's promiscuous, it's inappropriate, or we're going to invite two guys in while we're, hey guys, just come in here and watch this because I'm doing my Kiddushay Biyah. Now, what would that look like? How appalling is that? And secondly, it can't really be governed. In other words, part of what I think is a protest to Kiddushay Biyah is it takes away any pretense of a ceremony. All it is a man and a woman going into a room with the witnesses and performing this act. But where's the ceremony? Where are the parents? Where's the protocol? Right? That's all we're going to boil it down to, a specific act in the name of Kiddushin. And so I think that Rav is protesting, even though he says it's halachically legitimate, it would work. But we don't really want a boy and a girl coming back to their parents saying, hey, we just did Kiddushay Biyah, isn't that great? At least with kesef and shtar, there's the possibility of a little more policing. Right? We can hear that kesef and shtar took place. Biyah, they can slip behind the barn and anything can happen at the pond. There are so many places where Kiddushay Biyah can take place. Kesef and shtar is going to require a little more of, yes, you could do that anywhere also. But still. And so the reason I brought you Kiddushin 12b was to show that already in the Talmud, there is a protest against Kiddushay Biyah, and certainly without Shidduchei, even with Shidduchei, even if the parents, Shidduchei means with the tacit agreement of the father or the parents, nonetheless, there's something licentious about it, about this is what we're doing to transfer her status from one to another. We all know, by the way, why a kala goes to the chuppah. We know that's the act which essentially transforms the couple from before to after. But nonetheless, there should be Shabbat Brachot, there should be some wine, there should be something more than coarsening it with one particular act. Okay, and so that's what Bart is saying. The Mishnah, very bare bones, kesef, shtar, or biyah. Yeah, all of those, any of those can work. A man takes a woman into his house and begins to live with her, and that's marriage, right? If we want to look at it that way. But we can understand the movement towards a ceremony that represents, on a deeper level, what kiddushin really means. And with it, we bring kiddush, right? We bring the wine, we bring kedusha, we bring blessings, brachot. We bring a lot of the pieces that we see in other rituals we conduct to give a different kind of flavor and depth to how a woman's status changes from single to married. And of course, the woman is at the focus, meaning her status changing from single to married. Everyone with me? Because I want to move on to Gittin. Okay. We're going to skip the Shulchan Aruch. As you see, the Shulchan Aruch basically says again, I think the translation tries to v'nityahed ima b'pneihem, right? He secludes himself with her before two witnesses. I think the Shulchan Aruch is saying what I said about kiddushei biyah. Essentially, it has to be with witnesses. How inappropriate. Okay. I'm interested in Gittin 81a. And the reason I'm interested in it is it's going to set before us an interesting question about what do people have in mind? What do we wish people had in mind when they have sexual relations? Because it can be a very physical act, something very, spontaneous and physical and kind of like eating and drinking. But at its heart, it really represents dveikud, right? A man leaves his mother and his father. He cleaves to his partner, his wife, and they become basar achad. So we know the best that sexual relations represents, right? And Kabbalah certainly talks about the two aspects of God coming together in that union. But we also, and the halachic material is very aware of how empty and devoid of anything meaningful that act can be. And the truth is, I read books on this topic all the time, historical reflections on Jewish sources having to do with sexuality. It's not only in the 20th century, in the wake of the 1960s, that we've had questions about promiscuity. Promiscuity has plagued Jewish communities from the beginning of time, essentially, and this idea that people are driven by desire and desire for sexual relations that are devoid of anything meaningful is something that the human condition essentially brings before us. I just was reading some very interesting tshuvas. Even before marriage, betrothed couples commanding, as my grandmother would say, right, carrying on, right? That it's not, and obviously in the 16 and 1700s, things are a little more conservative and traditional than 21st century America or Israel, right? But nonetheless, all sorts of interest, you saw it in the sources, you saw, right? Things are happening. Things are happening, and questions are coming up as to the status of particular sexual acts. Okay, so let's go back to Gittin. So you have a couple that was previously married through Kiddushin, and they're now divorced through Gittin. That's what we're assuming. And they spend the night together in a pundak. And a pundak is kind of a place where things happen. It's like going to a hotel, getting a room together in a hotel. It is absolutely assumed that they had sexual relations, not because there are a day biyah. The Gemara makes it clear there are only a day yichud, that this couple went into a room and were alone together, secluded in the pundak. But it is assumed they had sexual relations, not partially, largely because they've been in a sexual relationship, a kosher one, a marital one. But even though they are no longer in that relationship, the temptation for a previously married couple to just say, what's the big deal, right? Who are we kidding? We've been here before. You know what? Let's comfort each other, right? Let's just be together. Is very great. And Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel have a machloket. What does Beit Shammai say? They don't need to get. What does Beit Hillel say? Why? What? Beit Shammai says, it's just one night. There's nothing marital about what just happened. There was no consequence. She's already a divorcee. She's no longer a virgin, so her ketubah is not going to be 200 zuz anyway. There's a familiarity there. It was just a night. What does Beit Hillel say? Why? Why does he think there might be an intent here?
Because people don't have relations unless they have intent.
Well, maybe. Why this couple, though? I want to focus on the previously married couple. Why does he assume more of this couple than he might of a man and a woman who take a room
Because
together?
they decided to get divorced.
They decided to get divorced, and
And they did.
they did get divorced, Martha.
But, well, he actually distinguishes between two cases.
Yeah.
Whether the betrothal was just betrothal, or whether it also
Right.
included
Sexual relations.
Sexual
Yeah.
relations. In the first case, it says, yeah, okay, it could be
Casual.
casual. In the second place, he says, come on, this is someone they're used to being with, so it's
So basically, the
Continuation.
argument the Gemara makes for Beit Hillel is as follows. By the way, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are already no longer with us when we start arguing about what they intended. Right? It's the Gemara having a conversation in the aftermath of the Mishnah. Why do they disagree? Beit Shammai, I think we all understand. Beit Shammai says a casual night in an inn is a casual night in an inn. She doesn't need another divorce. Beit Hillel says, no, wait a minute. They were once married. They once had a wedding night. And in the background of this night in the inn hovers the echo of all the other times they had marital relations, including the first time. And who's to say that there was not a split second where both of them thought about Kiddushin? That's why they need a get. I would say this, says the Gemara, about other cases, but this couple that once had lawful relations in the aftermath of Kiddushin are more likely than other couples to remember their marital Kiddushin relations. And as a result, they need to have a get again. Okay? We cannot necessarily learn for all couples, but a previously married couple, their relations constantly have the shadow, the echo of what once was, which was lawful sexual relations. The question that the Gemara brings up, Adam oseh bi'ilato bi'ilat znut, or ein Adam oseh bi'ilato bi'ilat znut. It's the Gemara bringing up this question, not Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. They use this test case of the divorced couple in the inn to wonder about, in general, does a man want his sexual relations to be illicit, or does he always want his sexual relations to be illicit? Okay? The Gemara brings up that question. Largely what they do is they deflect it by saying, oh, we're talking about a couple that was previously married and are divorced and are in an inn. We can't answer that question. Meaning, our answer is, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about a previously married couple who have sexual relations after divorce, whether she needs another get or not. But we can't answer it on a broader plane. Rambam answers it. If you got to Maimonides will answer it. Ultimately, what we do is we say, Ein Adam oseh bi'ilato bi'ilat znut, if he was once married to the woman. That's essentially our conclusion. If anyone watched Srugin in the first series, if you're nodding, then you've seen it, and maybe you didn't understand it at the time, and now you do. It's the married couple, Amir and his former wife, the curly-haired redhead. They end up going to say goodbye to their apartment to divide up whatever's left. The bed is still there, and the next scene is they're essentially tying their clothes up. They've had sex. And basically they agree to meet in the Rabbanut so he can discreetly give her another get, right? Because we do paskin like Beit Hillel. You saw that in Maimonides. Okay, so that explains that. Interesting that the writers chose to use that in their, and I think because it really reflects how easy it is for a previously divorced couple to kind of, especially if they're not in relationships with anyone else, they spend the night together, it's just familiar, it's comfortable, it's easy. It's what was, what do we have to lose? I'm not talking about whether she's nida or not, let's put that on the side, right? That question doesn't even come up in the newsroom. Okay, yes?
I just have a question about like that scene in the TV show. There weren't witnesses.
Yes, that's true, there weren't even a day yichud. It's an interesting question whether, look, I've known divorced couples who have been in similar situations. I have not they're not religious, and I have not advised them to go to the Rabbanut and bring that up at all. Very good point. The pundak, there are witnesses. It's not clear they really had to. They did it kind of l'chumrah, because they both felt something needed to be done, like in the aftermath. They couldn't just walk away. It's a TV show. It was a TV show. Yes. I think if they had asked a rabbi would have said, yes, get l'chumrah, largely to dissuade people from doing that. But you're right, there were no eight-day yichud. That's a very good point. Okay, turn to page 5. What I want to look at on page 5, again, he talks here, he got up to it, in 18, are eight-day yichud, eight-day biyah? And the answer is no, normally not, but Largely not, unless that a man, it's with his divorcee. It's with his divorcee. Okay. 19. Several of the Gaonim have ruled that any woman with whom a man engaged in sexual relations in the presence of witnesses requires a get. The rationale being that a person will not carry out sexual relations with a licentious intent. I will say, you have to remember the pundak is not like the Holiday Inns or the hotels we go to. It's kind of like stalls, right? You don't have a lot of privacy. So you would seclude yourself, but there might be a curtain. I mean, it's not very, very private. And so, that when the Gaonim say a man in the presence of witnesses, right? What if there are no witnesses? What if it's in a really secluded spot? But it's assumed that in the pundak, people are carrying on regardless of whether there are witnesses. Okay. I consider these opinions to be far from the paths of Torah judgment, and it is not fit for one to rely on them. Our sages made such statements only with regard to a wife whom he divorced, or to a person who consecrated a woman conditionally and then entered into sexual relations without clarifying his intent. So he said, if I have a situation where a man did what's called kiddushin al t'nai, and then he had sex with her, then I have a question whether it was znut or not, because he did some sort of kiddushin. There's a question what the condition is and whether it was fulfilled, but then I assume his sexual relations were not meant to be bilat znut. Okay, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. For in these instances, the woman is the man's wife, and with regard to a man's wife, we assume ein bilato bilat znut unless he explicitly states that this is his intent. So he rules like Beit Hillel that a previously divorced couple, when the man has relations with her, he doesn't treat his wife in such his ex-wife, in such a degrading manner. And he's not looking at it as a promiscuous act just to have a night. There's something of the familiarity and the love, the intimacy they once had. Same thing, kiddushin al t'nai, which is a separate topic. With regard to other women, however, we do not follow this assumption. Instead, whenever a man enters into relations with a wanton woman, I like the fact that she's wanton, what about him? Unless we assume that he had a licentious intent, unless he explicitly states that he intends to consecrate her. Needless to say, this applies with regard to a maidservant to a Gentile woman, for our marriage laws do not apply with regard to them at all. By the way, that leads a little bit to, and again, we always have our dirty laundry, so to speak. If a man is going to have an affair, if he's going to go to a prostitute, should he choose a Jewish or non-Jewish? The answer is he should go to a non-Jewish prostitute. In other words, there's no concern for kiddushin. It's a machloket whether nida is an issue for non-Jewish women, and that leads to the idea that men who are looking for a casual relationship will choose non-Jewish women because our marriage laws do not apply with them. It's only bilat znut. There's no concern that there might be a quasi-kiddushin situation. I will tell an anecdote. I was teaching this many years ago at Pardes, and I had a young man, and so he was saying, well, what I'm understanding from this is if I'm going to have casual sexual relations, it's better for me to have non-Jewish partners. So I said, well, halachically, that would be correct. And then I went home and I didn't sleep all night. I really bothered me that I had answered him. I mean, I tried to be very honest, and so on. And he came back in the morning. His father was a very distinguished professor of Talmud, not Orthodox, but like conservative. And I said to him, before he even opened his mouth, I said, I really have to say, I'm not comfortable with the answer I gave you. He's like 20, 21. I'm like, I really think, regardless of the halachic issues, you should take Jewish women. And he said, yeah, my father actually said the same thing. He agreed with your halachic analysis, but he said, you never know. With the woman you end up having a casual relationship with, you may end up falling in love or having a real relationship with. He also said to me, I said it was naval b'reshut haTorah, meaning it was like I was permitting something because I was doing a very critical analysis and halakhically correct, but the fear that could turn into something that would then lead to a relationship and possible marriage, stick to Jewish women. So it was funny that both, like his father basically said the same thing that I said, which is not, we're assuming you're going to be celibate and you should be celibate, and that's not realistic for a young man where he was in life, but definitely choose Jewish partners. I mean, that's what you should do. That should be your aspiration. Anyway, it was interesting. So Rambam is basically saying, meaning with a Gentile woman, it's bilat znut, but then I have no fear of kiddushin. There's no question of possible kiddushin, because clearly with a shivcha knanit or with a maidservant, there's no question. Okay. Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam. Okay, let's go on to now we're beginning to see. Now what happens from the son of the Rambam on, which again, we're in the 12th century, 12th, 13th century, we begin to see questions of Jews who are going off the derech, what's called mumarim or mishumadim. And then the question is, when they get married, is there kiddushin? Now, so let me just pause to say, by the 12th century, marriage looks a lot like you're familiar with, meaning there's a requirement of a minyan, you need 10 men, you need 2 witnesses, you have sheva brachot, you have the chuppah, you have the ring. There has been largely a conflation between kiddushin and nisuin. In the Gemara, it's 2 separate ceremonies, 2 separate protocols. A man would betroth a woman with kiddushin, and then they'd wait 12 months, and then they'd have what's called nisuin. And then only then would they be permitted to have sexual relations, right? Already, they begin to come closer together, and today we do it all at the same time. Right? Also, girls were very young when they got betrothed, so they would stay at home with their parents for a year, for 12 months to grow up, to prepare their dowry. As I said, a lot of the tshuvas are about hanky-panky that goes on in that window of time, right? There's already been either halachic betrothal or non-halachic betrothal, but there's a long window between the betrothal and the actual marriage, the social structure, the beginning to live together, the formal marriage, and so things happen in that window. Okay. The question the Rambam gets, you have a man who's a mishumad who married a woman who has left the faith. Both of them are mishumadim. He sits in Islamic countries, so he doesn't say the church, obviously. And he says they get married among the goyim, b'dinei goyim, and both act as Gentiles and violate the Shabbat. Does she have the law of a married woman? What's the story? Or is her status that of a single woman and there is no question of marriage between them? How do we view, they've gotten married, I'll make that very clear. There is no such thing as common law until, in my opinion, the 20th century, right? There's no such thing. They get married, they're living as husband and wife, and someone asks Rabbi Avraham, is she married or not? There's no kiddushin, they're mechalelei Shabbat, but they're living together as husband and wife. What would your answer be? What do you think? Do we consider her married or not? Is she a married woman or not? You would consider her married.
She's married, but not halachically married.
Okay, so now we're going to make a distinction. We consider her married, but we don't consider her halachically married. And his answer is, if you married her only in the Gentile court and do not perform kiddushin in front of 2 Jewish witnesses, she is not married. And if he did perform kiddushin in front of 2 kosher Jewish witnesses, then she is married. I mean, that's the criteria. Was there kiddushin? Wasn't there kiddushin? Were there 2 kosher witnesses? Weren't there 2 kosher witnesses? Was the formula followed? The fact that they are regarded in society as husband and wife does not make them halachically married. The Rivash.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
He doesn't define here what kiddushin.
No, he doesn't. But kiddushin at this point would be harayat b'kudesha li'b'tava. Would be kiddushin is always at this point, from the Mishnah period onward, is the transfer of an object worth a pruta or a document with language.
Plus language.
Plus the language.
Right,
That's already going to be.
he's not assuming
by the
it has to
Gemara.
be what if
No. Right. It's going to be the language. So he's saying if there isn't kiddushin in front of 2 witnesses. By the way, if there were bia in front of 2 witnesses with harei b'kudesha li b'biyazo, he would accept that. The Shulchan Aruch accepts it.
Could you please then translate the Hebrew just so
Yes.
I'm sure I have it?
You are now mikudeshet. You are separated in sanctity to me with this object, with this document, with this act of sexual relations in front of 2 witnesses. So we do require language. All sorts of questions come up. What if he doesn't say anything, but he gives her something and they've already talked about it beforehand and she knows? So she accepts the object, the pen, right? Again, there are all sorts of questions about what happens if the protocol isn't followed fully. In this case, the protocol wasn't followed at all. There is no protocol. Okay. A woman from Mallorca, this is a little bit like a telenovela. From the community of conversos to idolatry, which isn't it means to Christianity. I translated so you could see the language. And her child is in her arms, and she was asked, what is your status and the status of the child? And she said that a converso from Argonne had proposed to her before the decree prohibiting Jewish marriage. So again, she gets engaged a week before the Inquisition, essentially, outlaws Jewish marriage. So when she agrees to be betrothed, it's an engagement. No kiddushin has taken place. She's agreed to go for kiddushin, right? And then a week later, the decree is passed. A week later, another converso comes, who's a friend of the first one, who desires her, spoke to her heart and asked her to marry him, and she was taken in and agreed, and they decide to marry. So she marries like the best friend of the first guy who proposed her, and no problem, you know, and that's it. So now, no problem. The first proposal is nullified, was nothing. She now has agreed to marry this second converso, and he did not perform kiddushin in front of witnesses or in front of 10 men, but he went to the church and married her there. And she lived with him as a wife in every way and was known to many conversos as married. So she's known in the Jewish community of conversos as married, even though they're not married in a church. And again, this really brings up, what makes someone married? When do we just, is it really only the protocol, or is it a status? I mean, they're living as husband and wife. She actually becomes pregnant, and this is the child. And the man left on a journey across the ocean and has not been heard of again. And she wants to remarry, because single women did not support themselves. The best thing was to find a man who would support you. And let the rabbi tell us what to do with her. Do we have to consider her as a married woman? There is no question that betrothal or marriage, whatever you want to call it, that is done among the Gentiles and in the church are not kiddushin. Even if there would be witnesses, for the criteria of he gave her an object and said to her, behold, you are betrothed to me in the matter of Moshe and Israel, were not upheld.
And he's doing all the right things, but they're just in front of a priest.
Well, he's saying, even if you did kiddushin, but
it was done in the
Gentiles,
church.
right? It would not get, but she didn't. He says, and in this case, he did not give her an object. For the priest blessed them loudly and then gave each one a ring. The priest gave them the rings. The priest took out and said he gave them the rings. But the question is, what about the seclusion after the marriage, which is public knowledge? That's the real question. That's the question that comes up in Rav Moshe Feinstein. This is the question. We essentially are all a deichud. They go home and live together. They're having sexual relations because they got married. They pledged fidelity. They pledged monogamy, certainly in Christendom, right? So isn't that halachic marriage? Isn't that kiddushay biyah to some degree? Doesn't that at least hint to kiddushay biyah? They had a marriage ceremony, and then they go home, and she is now an Eshet Ish, meaning everyone knows she is now his wife. We're much more interested in her than in him. Okay, she is now his wife. She's expected to be Mrs. So-and-so in society. She's expected to be absolutely faithful to him because that's what the marriage ceremony affected. And she clearly had relations with him and became pregnant. And we know the text in Gittin that we saw. We know from the Talmudic sources that only sexual relations that are designated in the name of Kiddushin serve to turn her into a married woman according to Halacha. And anyone who does not perform sexual intercourse for the purpose of Kiddushin with witnesses is not married according to Halacha. And one can rely on this. Now he says, especially since he did not tell witnesses that he was secluding himself for the purpose of Kiddushin, and thus she is not married. He says something very interesting here though. And she is more like a concubine without ketubah and Kiddushin. He's in Spain in the 14th century. Definitely the question of concubine is much more relevant in Islamic countries than in Christian countries. A concubine would be someone with which you can have permitted sexual relations, but there's no kiddushin and no need for divorce. So you would work out some sort of contract as to what her rights and maintenance would be, because he wouldn't really owe her anything, not food, clothing, sex, right? Not like a wife. On the other hand, it's an interesting way for men to have, again, men can have more than one sexual partner, not another wife, but a pilegesh would meet the need of sexual partner without the commitment that a wife would require, both in society, a mistress. It would be a legitimate mistress, and the Ravad writes about it, and the Rivash is writing about it, in countries in which socially this was acceptable. Again, today we might recoil a little bit that such things were permitted. The question of pilegesh comes up in the 20th century as well. We'll maybe come back to that. But basically he says at the most she's a concubine. Meaning it's clear they're in a sexual relationship, it's clear it's committed, the pilegesh was expected. One question comes up, could a pilegesh have multiple masters? Meaning the pilegesh doesn't necessarily have to be monogamous, because it's not a marriage. It's an interesting question. Certainly you don't need a get. Meaning a pilegesh is a declaration that I am not your married partner, I am your mistress. So again, interesting topic for another class, but he basically says at the most she's like a pilegesh, no ketubah, no kiddushin. Hold on, let me just finish this. And the Re'eh wrote that we all know that since she considers herself, and he brings the Re'eh, The Re'eh is going to sound a lot like Rav Yosef Henkin in the 20th century. I'll talk the 20th century. The Re'eh wrote that we all know that since she considers herself his wife, and she is under his protection, and when secluded they have relations, she should be considered as married. The Re'eh is one of the only Rishonim who says, seriously, you're boiling marriage down, halachic marriage, to whether a protocol was followed? If a woman acts like wife and expects to be treated as wife, she should be considered halachically as wife. Marriage is not just a ceremony. Marriage is a state of being. It's a state of assumptions of one person to another. The Re'eh says, but again, luckily for us in many ways, he's a minority. He basically says if she considers herself married, she's under his protection, she secludes herself, and the church certainly considers them married, and the community considers them married, then she should be treated as a married woman halachically, which means what would she need? Okay. But that is one opinion. For the rest of the Rishonim wrote that there needs to be witness-assisted seclusion. There's no reason to rule according to this stringency in order to entrap her. He says one more thing I want to bring up before I take someone had a question. He says one more thing to, again, no tshuva ever has only one argument. Usually there are two or three kind of cobbled together to make the argument stronger. This is his main argument. He says one more thing. He says the mikvahs have been closed. In that area, and so she is nida. She is definitely nida. And he says, let's be honest. Sex with a nida is a much bigger deal than non-marital sex. And so if she's violating nida, then obviously she doesn't really care if she's married or not. And that's an argument that comes up also in Chuvas. Moshe cites it as well. Or we found, so basically, sex with midah equals kare, right? That's a major, he says, since clearly she can't go to the mikvah, mikvahs are closed, and she had a baby, so obviously they had sex, right? And since this is a kare punishment, then she doesn't really care about bilat znut. Because bilat znut is not as big a transgression as midah. That is, by the way, that's why the doors to the mikvah are locked to single women, right? This is considered to be a much bigger deal than this if I have to put on the scales the weight of transgression. Again, please don't misquote me. It's his argument. He basically says she can't possibly go to the mikvah, and this is a bigger deal than this, and she's violating this, then obviously she doesn't care if her bi'ulah is bi'ulah znut. She doesn't care if she's having non-marital relations on a conceptual level. The fact that she went to the church to get married doesn't help, he doesn't care.
Doesn't need the get.
She doesn't need a get. That's basically what his argument. So someone had a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think you made it even stronger. They're only going to the church because they're under threat of death.
Yeah,
They
of course,
get married
of course.
in shul. So does that change anything in terms of that argument that you just made isn't valid in that point?
Which point?
That she does care about, that's what her intention is for a
He's saying, but she got married knowing she'd be having relations as a nida. So obviously
She doesn't have a choice.
You're saying
She
that,
doesn't
okay,
force
so
it.
he doesn't care. I'm not saying he wouldn't be compassionate about
I'm not
her
talking about
choice.
compassion, I'm just saying.
Halakhically, he said
given
she made a
their
choice,
annuals.
they can live in celibacy, and they're choosing to do this, and as a result, this gives me a lot of halakhic room to look, he wants to free her.
Yes.
You have to remember that. That's
Yes.
ultimately his goal, even though it may sound offensive, right?
Yeah.
And if anything, is that he brings the Re'eh. He says the Re'eh thinks they should be considered married because they lived as married. And maybe we as readers say, oh, at least someone says what we're all thinking, the elephant in the room, and they're married. But he's basically saying there was no kiddushin, they're violating nida, and so there's no reason to consider her being married. Right? You're saying because they're anusim. Yes. That becomes an interesting question later on, whether we should have been more strict with her because she had no choice, rather than all these modern couples who flagrantly throw off kiddushin. They have no choice. The Rivash doesn't argue that. Later in the 20th century, someone makes that argument, that if there was coercion to this, then they, like in Soviet Russia, former Soviet Union, then maybe we should look at that as kiddushin. But no one really wants to do that.
Right.
Okay, there's no, the question is, what is my agenda? My agenda is to avoid mom saver.
Yeah.
That's my agenda. Okay, the Truman Adeshin, quickly, a young man went on a journey, again, fascinating story, a young virgin. I love the fact that he calls her a Betula throughout the Tshuva, because clearly she's not a Betula anymore, she's pregnant. She's traveling from city to city, explaining she's a poor woman. She's now pregnant, her belly is between her teeth, which means she's very pregnant. She told everyone, it's a term of the Gemara, I feel like women wouldn't have written it quite like that. She told everyone that this young man was the father, and he basically begins to malign her and say, I like the way he writes this, he never behaved in an unscrupulous manner, and gave some explanation that is not fit for ears to hear. So I love that. Like he maligns her, and afterwards she wants to get married. And some experts, I put that in quotations on purpose because he does as well, want to say that she's basically married to this guy and he needs to divorce her. And basically he's like, leave the experts to me. Like, who are you experts to say? And she said several times he promised to marry her and she should be married because perhaps one of the times he had kiddushin in mind and so on and so forth. So at first he starts off by saying, again, in a different class I like to talk about how a posek writes his responsa and the language he uses and the order in which he's going to permit her. But the way in which he does it is very clever. And he says initially it seems there's no room to permit her in this case. Well, except he didn't have relations with her in front of witnesses. And Maimonides and others all wrote the act must be done in front of witnesses. So he starts off by saying, doesn't look like we can do anything here, guys, you experts, you're all right, except, well, there was no kiddushei biyah, there were no witnesses, like, there's really not a problem. And therefore, even if he were to admit that he was the father, if there were not witnesses to the sexual relations, there is not kiddushin. And there was another case that came before me, and I always love when they bring other cases, because it really, you're like, oh, wow, look what's going on in the 14th century in Austria. A heretic who married a Jewish woman who also left the faith in front of the priest, and they were together for 2 to 3 years, and she became a Baal Tshuva. She repented and returned to the true religion, and then she married another man with kiddushin. And I permitted her, for there is no way that she and her former husband considered kiddushin as the basis of their marriage, even though he designated her for himself alone by getting married in the church. Right? He's saying you could look at marriage in the church as conceptually serving the same role that kiddushin serves, which is, again, pledging monogamy and fidelity and all those things that marriage is, giving her protection. And I have seen a few cases in which a single daughter of Israel, meaning several cases of single women, I was just translating literally, became pregnant and pointed to a specific man. And there was reason to believe her. And I never heard that such women were prevented from marrying other men because of fear of kiddushin associated with such a sexual act. So again, 14th century, there are all these single women who are getting pregnant for whatever reason. And then they point to a man saying, he's the father, and oh yeah, he must be the father. And no one considers that kiddushin. Okay, so, and here there is another reason to permit her, because the man in this case was married already. And if he had performed kiddushin with her, he would have violated Takanat Rabbeinu Gershon. And what is worse? Again, we're going to come back to what is worse. Violating the decree of Rabbeinu Gershon to take a second wife, or the fact that they had casual sex, bilat snut, which is not a severe transgression, or violating a rabbinic decree. Please don't call me. Now, Maimonides wrote well when he said such an act is simply the release of sexual desire and is not about kiddushin at all. Now again, I don't think he would write this if he were being asked, should people on college have permission to hook up, right? That's not what he's saying. But he's saying, look, if I have to do a, cost-benefit effect, equation, then ultimately violating Rabbeinu Gershon, and as the Rivash said, having sex with Anita is far more transgressive than bilat snut. Bilat snut is not nice, we don't like it, we disapprove of it, value-wise, and so on and so forth. But there are things that are much worse than bilat snut. Okay. And then the Shulchan Aruch Paskins that way. I'm going to turn to page 11. The Ramah basically says, wait a minute. No, sorry. I'm going to skip the Shulchan Aruch. You saw the Shulchan Aruch, very interesting. Basically, Paskins based on everything we're saying. And that brings us to the 20th century. So I want to say until the 20th century, the Rivash, the Truman Hadeshin, they are the main voices. If anything, it goes more and more in that direction. The Sha'agat Aryeh basically says there's no way to perform Kiddushei Biyah even if we want to. That door closes. And as we get towards the 20th century, we begin to see intermarriage. And we begin to see civil marriage, emancipation, reformation, all of those things are taking place. Which means that what Martha described as happening in South Africa can no longer be taken for granted in Europe, In other words, we can't really, as a community, police the marriages that are taking place outside of the community. The reform movement is gaining traction. People, as I said, are intermarrying. And this idea, no, but everyone gets married with Orthodox or halachic marriages, is the numbers are beginning to grow between 1800 and 1900, so that already by the beginning of the 20th century, it's recognized if we don't follow the Trumat Hadeshin and the Rivash and their approach, we're going to have mamzer problems. Divorce begins to increase, right? This idea, men disappear. And so they become really important voices in minimizing the amount of agunot and mamzerim as communities become less entrenched in tradition and in kiddushin and in halachic marriage. And that's what's also going to come before the Rabbanut. Take a look at Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, I will say, before I get to Rav Moshe Feinstein, Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, certainly not a lightweight by any means. I can't remember, does anyone know which community he was from? He's in Europe prior to the World War II. He died shortly, I think, before the Holocaust. Krakow? I think it is Krakow. He even writes a fascinating tshuva where he says a woman who is married civilly, who gets divorced civilly, is permitted to a Kohen. He doesn't consider it to be divorce in any way. She is not formally married. That's fascinating. A civil marriage, Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski has a tshuva where he says a woman who was married civilly and divorced civilly is so not considered married that she can marry a Kohen. That's a big deal. That is the obvious nafkamina, the obvious consequence of everything we're arguing here. If we don't consider it to be kiddushin, then it's not kiddushin. We don't need a get. You can call it bilat snoot all you want. But as long as her husband was Jewish, so if he was not Jewish, we'd have a problem for a Kohen. But if he was Jewish, then okay, they have bilat snoot. But a Kohen can marry a woman who's had bilat snoot as long as it wasn't a non-Jewish husband. Okay. Rav Henkin, and he wrote a book called Perish Ibra, and quite a bit of it, 2 chapters are devoted, 2 long chapters to this question. I would say his halachic arguments are complicated because he rereads a lot of the sources we saw and reads them in a way to promote what he wants to rule, which is that any form of marriage requires a get. Because he basically says, like the Re'eh, if a woman's considered to be Mrs. So-and-so, she needs a get. Let's not fool around here. Meaning, it's not the protocol, and it's not the 2 witnesses, and it's not saying you are now betrothed to me with this object. It's a state of being, and if she's been living as a married woman, and she's been having children, and she's recognized in society as married, she needs a get. And he says, yes, I know this will create, in theory, an enormous mamzer problem, but I have solutions for that also. I don't think he writes what his solutions are. I don't think he gets to that. But he says, I know I'm going to be critiqued for this, but I think we can work with this. We can't ignore what marriage really is. Marriage is not just a protocol that is followed or not followed. That's not what determines whether you're married or not. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, who disagrees quite aggressively with Rav Henkin, and for obvious reasons, not just because of all the precedent, not just because he is beholden or he is reflecting the Mishnah to the Talmud, to the Rambam, to the son of the Rambam, to the Rivash, to the Trumat Hadeshin. Meaning he has a lot of the halachic weight on his side, but because he recognizes the tremendous consequence of mamzerut and agunot that this is going to create, but he is going to respect Rav Henkin, and you'll see why in a moment. A woman who was married in the civil court and was not religious. And now here comes the story. And I shortened it. It's a fascinating story. A woman who was married civilly in the USA, lived with her husband for 2 months in a place where there were Jews, afterwards lived alone for 3.5 years, afterwards went back to her husband. It seems to me, if I read between the lines, there's something abusive there. He's constantly appearing and disappearing. Lived with him for 5 years in a Jewish community, but they had no contact with the religious Jewish community. Afterwards, he left her. She lived alone for half a year. Afterwards, he returned, and they lived in a place without religious Jews. They knew nothing about religion. And then they moved to Los Angeles, to a community with many religious Jews. And they lived there for 8 years in 4 different places. And each year, he would leave her for a period of time. This year, he left her and has not been heard from again. And during the last year after he left, she came under the influence of Torah and became religious, and she cannot get a get from her husband. Is there a room to allow her to remarry? And then the question is, she lived for 5 years among religious Jews who regarded them as husband and wife. So they're the Eidei Yichud, right? They're religious Jews, not just, okay. And they had children together. In public, she was known as Mrs. And although he left her many times, the neighbors knew that he returned and lived with her. And thus, if so many religious people consider her married, perhaps she needs a get, for a man does not want his sexual relations to be promiscuous. And perhaps he really did have relations with her one of the times for kiddushin. And when possible, one should try to get a get. That's because of Rav Henkel. But if it is impossible to get a get, and it will cause her to be an unmarried, chained woman, one can rely on the Rivash and the Ramah and the Tur, and who ruled like the Rivash and the Shulchan Aruch. For such people violate the laws of Torah, and thus have no presumption of kiddushin, and thus it is all as promiscuous relations and does not require a get. And nonetheless, one should make the effort of finding a husband and attracting a get. If impossible, one should permit her without a get. Basically, she's permitted without a get. I want to make that very clear. But because of Rav Henkel, it affects him, meaning first of all, he very much respects Rav Henkel, and he also recognizes the truth of it, meaning like, it's almost ridiculous that we dilute marriage down to, did you have witnesses and say around when they're living together, she's Mrs. So-and-so, she has children from him, she's regarded as married. There should be a get, at least the taste of a get, meaning we recognize that they're really married, but they're not halachically married. It's what you said. They're really married, but they're not halachically married. So I prefer to have a get because I want to ultimately, with a get, show that I recognize that all those years of marriage were not Milad's new. But if I have to, that's what I'll do. Right? And that's essentially what the Rabbanut rules today. But my friend, and then he says something, and I added this, it bothers me. I always believe in, again, bringing the sources, even if I find them difficult. But my friend, if this woman will not take upon ourselves keeping the laws of Nida, then we are helping her violate the prohibition of Nida, and we go out of our way to help chain women who keep Torah. But if she agrees to keep the laws of Nida, we should certainly help her. For if it is true that she only was married in the civil court, then there was no kiddushin. So that little piece, that catch. I will say that he becomes very important with regard to reform marriage. Meaning he also writes similar tshuvas, essentially saying that the reform rabbis are following the protocol of kiddushin like we do, but because they're Machalei Shabbos, it's not kiddushin. It is actually very important that Rav Moshe says what he says, because a lot of times we might recognize their kiddushin, but we're not recognizing their gittin, and again, mamzer, agunot, and so on and so forth. So basically, he writes it about reform, and it was extended also to conservative rabbis who aren't, conservative rabbis who aren't Shomer Shabbos and mitzvot and so on. So the problem obviously becomes conservative rabbis who are Shomer Shabbos. I'm not going to go into that.
I heard just very recently about a case where a woman in this type of situation, Jewish woman married to Jewish man, wanted to marry a Kohen, and that there's now in the currently there's issues going on where it was an abusive marriage. It was like this what you're describing, that there's possibilities that actually not be considered a marriage. Could you just comment on that? And she could actually qualify.
Well, was it a halachic marriage or not?
I believe it was, with issues of, was it abuse? I'm not
Yeah, no, I understand
certain,
what you're
but
saying.
You know, the issue
question, I mean,
that.
we have a very big Achilles heel today, and there's no question it's divorce, and there's no question in particular. You're talking about a totally different topic. What happens if a woman marries a man and discovers that he misled her, and really there was a history of a certain type of behavior beforehand that other people knew about or that was documented, there was mental illness, whatever it is. Rav Moshe actually, in specific cases, was willing to actually annul the marriage, but no one wants to expand. Anyway, that really is very, so I don't want any, hopefully she is dealing with a competent and very compassionate dating, and that they're trying to help her. What I want to turn to now, hopefully again you've gotten an overview, I've kind of given you a whirlwind tour through this topic. Halachically, largely the rabbinic courts agree with the majority opinion, which is if the marriage is not a halachic marriage, it does not require a get. They will try, because of Rav Henkin and Rav Moshe, to get a get l'chumrah for stringency's sake, but they recognize that ultimately if she remarries, the children are not mamzer. Okay, turn the page. There have been various options proposed in the framework of public discourse, page 14. 4 of the main options are presented below. So I really want to walk you through is what could the state of Israel look like if we introduce some sort of civil marriage. The first suggestion that's on the table is 2 legal structures for marriage. People can choose between civil or religious. They will be kept completely separate, a complete separation of church and synagogue, right? In the sense that the state will monitor the civil track and the Rabbanut will monitor the religious track, but there will be no interaction. Couples will decide for themselves which track to choose, religious or civil, but the laws for each will be separate and distinct from each other. You can read a little bit more about it there. Civil marriage would end in civil divorce, religious marriage in religious divorce. The problem is it does not open up the possibility of Reform and Conservative, right? It would only be religious, would only be Orthodox. And then another concern that's been brought up is the delegitimization of the Agunah crisis, because people might say, well, you asked for it. You could have had civil marriage. Today, everyone's in the same boat. Every woman who gets married through the Rabbanut has the same danger of possibly being Agunah. But now if you have an option to choose the non-Agunah track, we're going to say, well, look, you should have taken the who cares? Meaning that's your problem. Okay, that's a concern. So number 2, I'm just saying if you read it, that is the concern, that ultimately the secular population will not be sympathetic. Right now, everyone's sympathetic to this problem because secular and religious alike find themselves in the same situation because of the rabbinic court law. If we separate completely, then ultimately you end up with 2 parallel tracks and only really religious people are going to be in that track, and that's going to possibly delegitimize their crisis with, well, you have an option, why would you take, that's all I'm saying. And again, you could agree or disagree with that analysis. It's not my analysis, it's the analysis of 2 major legal thinkers who have analyzed this topic. Hold on a second. Civil union option. Civil union is an agreement between 2 partners to establish a family unit. Couples who are not interested in a religious wedding or could not marry according to religious law will legally formalize their relationship in a special registry. They'll have the legal rights and obligations that law gives to married couples, social benefits, inheritance rights, property rights, alimony, eligibility to adopt children. It'll be parallel to religious marriage and divorce, but there will be no contact again between the 2 systems. Marriage will be religious marriage, again, in the hands of the religious courts. And couples who choose civil union will deliberately not be choosing kiddushin. And then we'll have to create laws to deal with dissolution of such unions. One of the arguments against this is it leaves marriage and divorce, again, only under the authority of the rabbinic court. Civil union avoids the term marriage. At the same time, the Orthodox are concerned opening up civil unions to all who seek them weakens the rabbinic court's exclusive authority. Yes, of course. Anyway, that is definitely something that's on the table. It may be easier to push through than number 1, 3, or 4. Okay, number 3. Number 3 is going to be more like America, England, France. Separation between Rabbanut and state. The state will grant the license. You have to go to the state to get your license, and then you choose how you want to get married. And then you have a smorgasbord. In other words, once I have separated church and state, again, sorry, for the rabbinate and state, right, in the matter of marriage and divorce in Western democracies, the couple can choose whatever type of marriage ceremony they want. Reform, conservative, civil union, secular, whatever they want, Buddhist, right, anything they want, Orthodox. And the state is in charge of issuing the license. The state does not intervene in religious ceremonies and rituals surrounding marriage and divorce, unless a man refuses to give his wife a get, and then the state can use whatever resources it uses. So essentially, the state will oversee marriage in the manner of other countries. There would be no competition between state and religion, and so on and so forth. Number 4, let me just explain number 4, and then I'll take questions. Number 4 refines number 3. It was Ruth Gavizan, who was a Chief Justice, and Rabbi Yaakov Meidan came up with number 4. Rabbi Yaakov Meidan is the Rosh Yeshivat Har Etzion, where the state would oversee the license. You would go to the state to get your license, choose whatever ceremony you like, no religious coercion. But if a woman wants to remarry, the Rabbanut has the right to see if she needs a get, right? And only if she's had a religious ceremony. That's essentially what number 4 would be. That it would allow at least the Rabbanut. In number 3, I guess it would be like America. The Beit Din would have to investigate every case that comes before it. But here at least the Rabbanut lechatchila will make note of whoever's getting married and what ceremony, so that if Sarah comes after having a secular, a civil marriage and wants to remarry in a religious marriage, they'll know she doesn't actually need a get, right? We're going to rule like the majority opinion. Maybe we'll try to get a get if we can, the chumrah, but ultimately the initial registration is through official state channels, but a person will only be recognized as able to remarry if he or she meets the religious criteria for that definition, and that means only halachic marriage the first time, right? That's what you really get. I will say, one of the things that's come up also is if you choose a non-halachic marriage, you essentially, wherever you sign up, you basically say, I recognize this as non-halachic marriage, and that then, again, makes it even clearer it's non-halachic marriage and so on. So you can read more about this. I give you more information there about each of these tracks. I would say, my personal preference would be number 4. I think it maintains both fidelity to a democracy, but also to halacha and to having the Rabbanut involved where I think it should be involved, but not overly involved, no religious coercion. But I would be okay with number 2 also, meaning a civil union option for anyone who doesn't have a religious marriage. At least, again, that would give legal protection within the country to citizens who can't get married or don't want to get married through the Rabbanut, but that's my own personal preference. Did someone have a question of clarity? Yes.
Well, I don't see any reason why numbers 1, 2, and 3 cannot have aspects of 4. In other words,
They probably
everything, we have computers today, everything can be recorded.
Yeah. You'd be surprised how not in sync government computers are, which is really insane.
Okay,
sure.
And
Yeah.
this
But
period, in
you
other
could-
words, as soon as a couple gets married or is registering for some kind of
You could
marriage,
have-
any
yeah,
directions,
yeah.
there should be
There should be,
somewhere.
right. Again, I think if you have an overall structure, but that would essentially, what you're saying is the state issuing the license is essentially what we want. The state being the body through which marriage is facilitated rather than the Rabbanut will solve all, basically, is necessary for all 4 of these. For all 4 of these, except number 1
Okay,
says.
or whichever body does some kind of a marriage would have to have, and
Recognition by the
some
state.
central database.
Central database, but again, I would want it run by the state, not by the Rabbanut.
Okay. How does the Rabbanut feel about this?
It's a very funny question. I think the Rabbanut is fighting tooth and nail for control and exclusive control of the net. I don't think it's only for pure halachic reasons. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of power, unfortunately or fortunately. They did make a concession not long ago in 2010, I think it was 2010, when they were about to lose a very big case with Aaron Barash, and they agreed to recognize non-halachic marriage as marriage. I think it's inevitable. I think that everyone kind of realizes this is going to have to happen, but they're fighting it. There's no question about it. Yeah.
I think you touched on the beginning, but so what happens now in Israel if somebody gets married outside of Israel, has a marriage license, is now recognized in Israel, now they want to get divorced?
Very, very, basically there are, meaning you're going to be going through other legal channels to dissolve that partnership or that, but
Let's say like
the
it's a non
Rabbanut has been given, what basically has happened, and this was because of Aaron Barak. Aaron Barak basically turned to the Rabbanut and says, if you don't start recognizing non-halachic marriages as marriages, we're taking the monopoly away from you, because this is impossible. You can't have couples getting married in Cyprus and then coming back here, and then you don't even recognize them as married, but you have exclusive monopoly over marriage. So what's happening in the Interior Ministry doesn't give them the ability to go to family court, for instance, because they're not recognized as married. So the Rabbanut agreed to evaluate on a case-by-case level any of these situations to see if they need a get or not, l'chumrah, and then to turn them over to the family court. So there was some movement in that sense in legal recognition. Also, there are different contracts that can be signed by couples, and presumably, couples who are a little mature and have assets, they sign contracts already in the event of divorce. But now at least the family courts can deal with some of these cases because the rabbinate oversees. Oh, yeah, okay, you got married, we recognize that you're married, and now we're shifting you over to family court. But it's very messy, it's still bureaucratically a mess. Anyway, thank you very much, you've been wonderful.